The morning sun had painted Lantern's End in deceptively golden hues when Detective Victor Hale stepped off the eastbound freight train, his appearance carefully crafted to suggest a traveling businessman rather than a federal investigator. His worn leather satchel contained mining investment documents, forgeries, but convincing ones, while his true purpose lay hidden beneath layers of manufactured identity. For 3 months, the Pinkerton agency had been gathering whispers about Barlow Pike's operations, rumors that spoke of bribed officials, silenced witnesses, and workers who simply vanished when they asked too many questions about safety procedures. Hale adjusted his spectacles and surveyed the settlement with practiced casualness. Lantern's End sprawled along the railroad line, like a wound that refused to heal properly, its buildings a mixture of hastily constructed commercial structures and ramshackle dwellings that housed the mining crews. The Chinese laundry stood at the settlement's eastern edge, its proprietor already hanging wet garments despite the early hour. The Brass Lantern Saloon dominated the main thoroughfare, its batwing doors promising refuge from the Dakota Territory's harsh realities. And there, nestled beside the railroad depot, sat Edwin Whitcomb's telegraph office, the nervous system of this isolated community. The detective had learned to read towns the way other men read newspapers. Lantern's End reeked of fear disguised as prosperity. Store owners kept their eyes downcast when certain men passed. Conversations died abruptly when specific names were mentioned. Children played quietly, as if loud laughter might attract unwanted attention. These were the symptoms of a community under the thumb of a man who confused power with authority, wealth with worth. Hale made his way to the telegraph office with measured steps, his boots stirring dust from the hard-packed earth. Through the window, he could see Edwin Whitcomb bent over his brass key fingers, moving with the practiced rhythm of a man who had spent decades translating human thoughts into electrical impulses. The telegrapher was perhaps 50 years old with graying hair and the pallor that came from spending most daylight hours indoors. But his eyes held an alertness that suggested a mind still sharp despite the tedium of his daily routine. The bell above the door chimed as Hale entered, causing Edwin to glance up from his work. "Morning, stranger. Something I can send for you. For Victor Hale." The detective replied, extending his hand in greeting. "Representing Eastern mining interests. I understand this territory offers opportunities for the right kind of investor." Edwin's handshake was firm, but Hale noticed the slight tremor that spoke of nervous tension barely held in check. "Mining opportunities, yes, sir. Plenty of those around here. Though I'd recommend speaking with Mr. Barlow Pike if you're serious about investments. He owns most of the productive claims in these parts. So I've heard. Quite the successful businessman from what people tell me." Hale kept his tone carefully neutral, watching Edwin's face for subtle reactions. The telegrapher's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Successful, yes. Mr. Pike has certainly made his mark on this territory." The words carried undertones that spoke volumes about what couldn't be said directly in a community where Pike's men had long ears and longer memories. "I imagine a man in your position sees a great deal of what happens in a place like this," Hale observed, letting the suggestion hang in the air between them. "Telegraph operator learns all the town's business, whether he wants to or not." Edwin's eyes met his briefly, and in that moment, Hale saw recognition of a shared understanding. The telegrapher knew corruption when he saw it, but lacked the power or protection to do anything about it. The detective filed that knowledge away for future use, sensing a potential ally if circumstances ever required one. "A man learns to mind his own business in a place like this," Edwin said carefully. "Safer that way for everyone involved." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, a young woman perhaps 25 years old with the practical dress and no-nonsense manner of someone who worked for her living. She nodded politely to both men before approaching Edwin's counter. "Morning, Mr. Whitcomb. Need to send word to my sister in Deadwood about Pa's condition." "Of course, Sarah. You know I'll get it through as quick as possible." As the woman began dictating her message, Hale noticed Edwin's manner with her protective, almost paternal. The detective filed that observation alongside his others, beginning to build a picture of the telegrapher as a man who cared about his community, despite the dangers that caring might bring. The message completed and payment exchanged, Sarah departed with grateful thanks. Edwin turned back to his guest, but before either could speak, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were coming down the main street, at a pace just short of reckless, their mounts lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air. Hale recognized the type, immediately hired guns, with the swagger that came from knowing they were protected by wealth and influence. The leader was a man of perhaps 30 years with red hair and the kind of scarred face that spoke of violence, both given and received. His companions were cut from similar cloth-hard men who solved problems with bullets rather than words. "Pike's men," Edwin murmured, his voice barely audible. "Red Deke and his crew. They're early today." "Early for what?" Before Edwin could answer, the riders dismounted outside the saloon and disappeared through its batwing doors. Within moments, raised voices could be heard through the thin walls, though the words were indistinct. Someone was being questioned about something, and the questioners were not being gentle about their methods. "Our collection day," Edwin said finally, his face pale but resolute. "Pike's men make regular rounds ensuring everyone understands their obligations to his business empire." Hale nodded, filing away another piece of evidence in the case he was slowly building against Barlow Pike. The Pinkerton agency had been hired by railroad interests to investigate cost overruns and construction delays. But what they were uncovering went far deeper than simple financial irregularities. This was systematic corruption on a scale that demanded federal intervention. "Well," the detective said, picking up his satchel with studied casualness, "I should probably find accommodations for the night. Early start tomorrow if I'm going to survey those mining claims." "Pioneer House offers clean beds," Edwin suggested. "Mrs. Henderson runs it honest." The 2 men shook hands again, and Hale thought he detected a slight pressure in Edwin's grip, a silent acknowledgement of their earlier unspoken communication. As the detective headed for the door, the telegrapher's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hale, be careful who you trust in this territory. Not everyone who seems friendly has your best interests at heart." The warning was clear enough, and Hale nodded his appreciation before stepping back into the dusty street. As he walked toward the Pioneer House, he could feel eyes watching from various windows and doorways. His arrival had been noted cataloged, and no doubt would be reported to Pike within the hour. That was fine. It maintained his cover while allowing him to gauge the extent of Pike's surveillance network. But as he settled into his rented room and began transcribing his observations into coded notes, Detective Hale had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would transform his careful investigation into a desperate race against time and violence. Miles away beneath the blazing afternoon sun, iron rails sang their death song as a massive freight locomotive thundered across the endless grasslands toward Lantern's End. The steel rails hummed with lethal purpose beneath the merciless Dakota Territory sun, their iron voices growing louder with each thunderous heartbeat as the massive freight locomotive devoured distance across the boundless sea of buffalo grass. August 1878 had brought scorching heat to this corner of the American frontier, where silver mines carved profitable scars into ancient earth and telegraph wires carried broken promises between white settlers and the proud Lakota nation. Bound between those gleaming rails with coarse hemp rope that had already painted her wrists crimson lay 11-year-old Lena Whitcomb. Her cornflower dress, pristine as Sunday prayers just hours before, now bore the stains of dust, terror, and blood. The thick ropes held her fast to sun-baked wooden ties, and her emerald eyes reflected a fear so pure it seemed to distill the very essence of every child's darkest nightmare into crystalline terror. The approaching locomotive had become her entire universe, a monstrous wall of black iron and hissing steam that devoured everything in its relentless path. She could feel its terrible weight in her bones, now vibrations that started in the rails and traveled through wooden ties into her small body, like the pulse of some mechanical heart bent on destruction. Coal smoke filled her nostrils, mixing with the metallic scent of superheated steel. And somewhere in the distance, the engineer's whistle screamed across the buffalo grass like the cry of a dying giant. Lena tried to call for help, but panic had sealed her throat with invisible fingers. Only strangled whimpers escaped, lost beneath the growing thunder of iron wheels on steel rails. She twisted desperately against her bonds, feeling hemp fibers bite deeper into tender flesh. Each movement drew more blood-crimson drops, falling onto weathered wood, like sacrificial offerings to some terrible god of steam and steel. The train loomed larger, 300 yards, and closing fast, its cowcatcher gleaming like the maw of some prehistoric beast awakened from the depths of time itself. From the tall blue-stem grass bordering the tracks, a shadow detached itself with fluid silence that spoke of years spent moving unseen through hostile territory. Tasunke emerged from concealment, despite the pronounced limp that marked his right leg, a permanent reminder of the cavalry bullet that had shattered bone and dreams 3 years past. He was a Lakota warrior in his early 30s, coal-black hair braided with strips of leather, worn smooth by countless seasons of hardship and survival. His buckskin shirt bearing the patina of a man who lived close to the land's unforgiving realities. His obsidian eyes assessed everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The child, the restraints, the iron leviathan now 200 yards distant and closing with the inexorable momentum of manifest destiny itself. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees beside the track-scarred hands, working at his belt to draw forth a bone-handled knife whose blade had been honed to razor sharpness by years of careful maintenance and harder use. "Be still, little one," he commanded in English, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who had mastered a foreign tongue through necessity rather than choice. His accent bore the rhythmic quality of his native language, each word chosen with deliberate precision, born of understanding that words could be weapons in the wrong mouths. Lena's gaze fixed upon his weathered features, and fresh terror flooded through her young heart like ice water through summer streams. Stories rose unbidden from the depths of childhood fears, tales of savage Indians who collected scalps and burned homesteads, warriors who knew no mercy and gave no quarter. Yet, as Tasunke's blade began sawing through the first rope with desperate efficiency, she glimpsed something in his dark eyes that made her swallow her scream. There was fierce concentration there, yes, but also an unexpected gentleness in how he worked to free her without adding to her wounds. The memory struck him then sudden as lightning and twice as painful. His younger brother Mahpia had possessed eyes like this child's, green as spring grass, wide with trust that the world held more good than evil. Mahpia, barely 18 summers old when Pike's accident had crushed him beneath tons of rock and broken timber, had looked at the white world with similar faith. Even as he took the dangerous work in Pike's mines, even as he descended daily into those death-trap shafts, Mahpia had believed that honest labor would be rewarded with honest wages, that safety measures existed for reasons beyond mere profit calculations. Brother Mahpia had said in their final conversation, "I will work only until the snows come. Then I will have enough saved to buy Winona's children warm blankets for winter. The mine foreman says I am strong worker. Perhaps there will be bonus for those who show dedication." Dedication. As if dedication could reinforce rotting timbers or make unstable shafts suddenly safe. As if Pike cared about anything beyond extracting maximum silver for minimum expense, regardless of the human cost involved. The memory fueled Tasunke's desperation as he worked to free this child, who carried no responsibility for her people's actions, who deserved protection rather than punishment for the sins of others. His damaged leg protested as he shifted position, the old wound sending familiar spikes of pain up his thigh. But he ignored the discomfort with practiced stoicism. 150 yards. The locomotive's whistle shrieked again, its voice tearing through the afternoon air like the scream of some metallic banshee. The engineer had spotted trouble on his tracks and was fighting physics itself, brake shoes pressed against iron wheels with showers of orange sparks that looked like fallen stars in the harsh sunlight. But momentum and mass were merciless masters, conspirators against any hope of stopping the steel behemoth in time. 100 yards. Tasunke cursed in his native tongue as the rope proved thicker than anticipated, each strand woven with a stubborn strength that spoke of quality hemp, designed to hold against exactly this kind of desperate cutting. His blade caught on particularly stubborn fibers, and precious seconds ticked away, like drops of life's blood spilled on thirsty ground. Heat from the approaching engine washed over them in waves that spoke of furnaces and coal fires, while somewhere beneath the growing cacophony, he could hear the grinding shriek of metal against metal as the train fought its own unstoppable weight. 75 yards. The first rope parted with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud despite the approaching thunder of iron wheels and hissing steam. Lena's left arm came free, and she clawed at the remaining bonds with desperate fingers that left scratches on her own skin in their urgency. Tasunke rolled her sideways, trying to clear the deadly rails, but the rope around her right wrist had somehow tangled itself in the iron spikes that anchored track to wooden foundation with unforgiving precision. 50 yards. The locomotive towered above them, like a cliff face of black iron and polished brass, its bell clanging frantically, while steam hissed from release valves like the breath of angry serpents. The engineer hung from his cab window face, white with horror, as he witnessed the drama unfolding on his tracks, a drama he was powerless to stop bound, as he was to the laws of physics and the terrible mathematics of momentum. 30 yards. Tasunke's damaged leg buckled beneath him as he threw his full weight into freeing the tangled rope, using his knife blade as a lever to pry the hemp away from its anchor point. Pain shot up his thigh like liquid fire, but he gritted his teeth and continued working with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that failure meant witnessing the death of innocence itself. The hemp fibers began parting under pressure, individual strands snapping with tiny sounds, lost in the approaching cacophony of destruction. 20 yards. The world became a symphony of noise and heat and rushing shadow that spoke of civilization's power turned toward devastating purpose. Tasunke could see individual rivets in the locomotive's iron hide, could smell the oil and coal dust that clung to its mechanical bulk like incense in some terrible cathedral of progress. His knife blade twisted, finding purchase at last against the stubborn rope that held this child bound to her fate. 15 yards, 10-5. With a final desperate wrench that sent fresh agony through his injured leg and nearly toppled him onto the tracks alongside his intended victim, Tasunke yanked Lena clear just as the locomotive's cowcatcher swept over the precise spot where she had lain like a sacrifice to the gods of greed and railroad schedules. The warrior threw himself over the child, shielding her small body with his own, as the freight train roared past, car after car of merchandise and mining equipment, each adding its voice to the mechanical symphony of iron wheels and creaking couplers that spoke of a nation's hunger for the resources buried in Western Earth. Hot cinders rained down upon them like malevolent snow, stinging exposed skin and filling the air with the acrid scent of burned coal that would linger in their clothing and hair for days to come. The backdraft from passing cars created a vortex of wind and dust that tried to pull them back toward the deadly rails. But Tasunke held fast, his body serving as human anchor against the locomotive's hungry grasp. The caboose finally clattered past its red lantern, disappearing into the heat shimmer, like the eye of some departing dragon returning to whatever mechanical hell had spawned it. Silence rushed back across the grasslands, like a tide returning to shore, broken only by the distant whistle as the train continued its inexorable journey toward Lantern's End, its crew unaware of how close they had come to becoming unwitting executioners in someone else's murderous game. Tasunke rolled away from Lena and pushed himself up on trembling elbows, his leg throbbing with renewed intensity from the sudden exertion and awkward position. The child lay motionless for several heartbeats, her chest rising and falling with the rapid rhythm of terror, barely survived, then sat up slowly and stared at him with eyes that held wonder rather than the fear he had expected. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from dust and the screams that had died unborn in her throat. The warrior studied her face with the careful attention he might give to reading animal tracks in soft earth, looking for signs of injury shock or the kind of mental damage that sometimes followed such traumatic encounters. She was perhaps 11 summers old, with chestnut hair that had been neatly braided before her ordeal, but now hung in disheveled tangles around shoulders that were far too thin for someone her age. Her dress bore the unmistakable marks of rough handling torn fabric, where hands had grabbed and pulled grass stains that spoke of being dragged across ground, and dark spots where her own blood had soaked through the cotton. Around her neck hung a small brass locket on a tarnished chain, its surface worn smooth by countless nervous touchings. Something about that simple ornament nagged at the edges of Tasunke's consciousness, like a half-remembered dream, though he could not immediately place why it seemed significant. He gained his feet with careful movements that disguised the true extent of his disability, each shift of weight sending fresh complaints from his damaged leg up into his hip and spine. The old cavalry bullet had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent reminder of his encounter with a patrol that had strayed too far from Fort Abraham Lincoln in pursuit of what they termed hostile Indians. That encounter had cost him more than just the full use of his leg. It had cost him his younger brother's life and any remaining faith he might have held in white man's justice. But such memories belonged to another day, another pain. Now his hunter's instincts were alert for more immediate dangers, senses tuned to the subtle signs that spoke of pursuit and violence. Yet to come. Half a mile down the railroad line, a switchman had emerged from his wooden shack and stood pointing in their direction, his voice carrying faintly on the wind as he shouted warnings to someone out of sight beyond the rolling hills. "They'll come for you," Lena said, struggling to stand on legs that shook with exhaustion and lingering terror. "The sheriff and his men. They'll say you put me here because you're Lakota." The warrior's expression hardened with the bitter knowledge that came from 3 years of living as a marked man in territory, where justice wore a white face and spoke with forked tongue. In the time since Colonel Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn, relations between whites and Indians throughout Dakota Territory had grown poisonous as rattlesnake venom. Any misfortune, any crime, any inconvenience was swiftly attributed to the savage red man, regardless of evidence, logic, or simple human decency. Truth was a luxury that few white men could afford when it conflicted with their carefully maintained prejudices and profitable hatreds. "Then we must leave this place," he said, simply taking her elbow to help her find her balance on ground that seemed to shift beneath her feet like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. She was lighter than he had expected, her bones feeling as fragile as birds' bones beneath skin that had gone pale with shock. Her hands trembled with the aftershocks of her brush with death, and he could see the rope burns around her wrists beginning to swell with the first signs of infection. They moved away from the tracks with deliberate haste, Tasunke's limp more pronounced now that adrenaline was beginning to fade and pain was reasserting its familiar claim on his body. Behind them, he could hear the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming hard across the flats, no doubt armed with righteousness, and lead in equal measure, eager to dispense frontier justice to whatever Indian they found at the scene of this apparent atrocity. 50 yards from the rails, hidden in grass, tall enough to conceal a man on horseback, waited Paint Tasunke's faithful Mustang, and perhaps the only living creature in all of Dakota Territory that he trusted without reservation. The animal was a study in patience and intelligence, its dappled brown and white coat blending perfectly with the shadows cast by waving stems of buffalo grass that moved like ocean waves in the constant prairie wind. Across the saddle hung a military carbine, likely taken from the same cavalry patrol that had given Tasunke his permanent limp, along with a canvas water bag that had seen better days and a small leather pouch containing his meager medical supplies. Without ceremony or explanation, the warrior lifted Lena onto Paint's back, noting how she settled into the worn saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent time around horses, despite her obviously urban upbringing. Then he took the reins in his scarred hands and began jogging alongside the horse, his injured leg forcing him to adopt a careful, measured pace that conserved energy while still covering ground. Each step sent spikes of discomfort up his thigh and into his hip, but he had learned long ago to endure such trials without complaint. Survival in hostile territory often depended on one's ability to function, despite pain, exhaustion, and the constant threat of discovery. They followed an ancient game trail that meandered away from the railroad through rolling hills covered in buffalo grass and dotted with scattered groves of cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered secrets in languages older than the coming of the white man. The late afternoon sun beat down with the merciless intensity that characterized Dakota summers, and Tasunke could feel perspiration soaking through his buckskin shirt and running down his back in rivers of salt and discomfort. But distance was their ally now. Each mile they put between themselves and the scene of Lena's rescue was another mile farther from the rope that waited in some Lantern's End jail cell for any convenient Indian neck. After traveling perhaps a mile through terrain that grew increasingly broken and difficult, they paused beside a small creek that wound between low banks lined with willow trees, whose drooping branches created natural curtains of green privacy. The water ran clear and cold, speaking of distant mountains and clean snow that had never been touched by the corruption of human ambition. Tasunke helped Lena down from the horse and knelt beside the stream to cup the precious liquid in his hands, feeling its coolness against his palms like a blessing from spirits he had almost forgotten how to honor. "Hold out your wrists," he instructed, gently gesturing toward the angry rope burns that marked her pale skin like brands of ownership that some monster had tried to impose upon her young flesh. The injuries were worse than his initial assessment had suggested. The hemp had cut through the epidermis in several places, creating raw wounds that were already beginning to show the first signs of festering in the heat and dust of their escape. He washed them carefully with stream water, noting how the child bit her lower lip to keep from crying out. As the liquid stung her damaged flesh, her small face set in lines of determination that spoke of strength beyond her years. From his medicine pouch, he withdrew a small obsidian blade that had been napped by his grandfather's hands in a time when such tools were matters of survival rather than curiosity. With this blade, he cut a strip of cloth from the sleeve of his buckskin shirt, the material soft and clean from treatment with herbs that would help prevent infection from taking hold in wounds that might otherwise fester and poison the blood. He bound her injuries with the practiced skill of a man who had tended many wounds over the years his own, and those of others who had fallen victim to the violence that seemed to follow wherever whites and Indians came into contact. His touch was gentle despite the roughness of his hands, fingers moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that healing was as important as hurting in the great balance of existence. "What are you called?" he asked as he worked his voice, carrying the formal courtesy that his people reserved for first meetings with strangers who had proven themselves worthy of respect. "Lena Whitcomb," she replied, her voice growing stronger now that she was removed from the immediate proximity of death and destruction. My adoptive pa, is Edwin Whitcomb. He operates the telegraph at the depot in Lantern's End." Tasunke nodded his recognition of the name with something approaching surprise. Edwin Whitcomb had earned a reputation as an honest man throughout the territory, one of the few whites who dealt fairly with Indians when circumstances required such interaction. The warrior had never met him personally, but his sister Winona had spoken well of the telegrapher on the few occasions when their paths had crossed in the neutral territory of commerce and communication. "I am called Tasunke," he said, finishing the bandaging with a careful knot that would hold without cutting off circulation to her fingers. "It means horse in the language of my people, though I suspect you have been told many lies about my people and their ways. Why would someone tie me to those tracks?" The question burst forth as if she had been holding it back through sheer force of will, her young mind finally ready to confront the horror of what had been done to her. Who would want to hurt me like that? The warrior settled back on his heels and studied her face with the careful attention he might give to reading weather signs on a cloudy horizon, looking for the strength that would be needed to bear the weight of truth. There was resilience in those emerald eyes. He realized the kind of inner toughness that reminded him of the women of his own people who had endured loss and hardship without surrendering their essential humanity or their faith in the possibility of justice. She deserved an honest answer, even if the truth was more frightening than comfortable lies. This was not the work of chance or accident. He said, carefully choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that careless speech could wound as surely as any weapon. Someone wanted you to die, or wanted to use your death for their own purposes. The ropes that bound you were tied with skill placed with deliberate intent. You were not meant to escape on your own. The implications of his words seemed to settle upon the child like a cold wind from the north, bringing with it the chill of adult understanding thrust too early upon young shoulders. She wrapped her thin arms around herself and stared at the water flowing past their feet, its gentle murmur providing stark contrast to the violence they had so recently escaped. "Pa disappeared last night," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of terrible knowledge. "He came home from the depot carrying a leather book, a ledger of some kind. He seemed frightened, kept looking over his shoulder like someone might be following him through the darkness. This morning, when I woke up, he was gone. That's when the men came." "What men?" "Rough men who smelled like whiskey and mine dirt with guns on their belts and cruelty in their eyes. They dragged me from our house while I was still in my nightgown, tied me up with those ropes while I begged them to tell me what had happened to my father. One of them, the one with red hair and scars on his face, said something about making an example, about showing folks what happens when people don't mind their own business." Tasunke's expression grew increasingly grim as pieces of a larger and more sinister puzzle began arranging themselves in his mind with the terrible clarity of dawn breaking over a battlefield. A missing telegrapher, a mysterious ledger that had frightened an honest man, and hired thugs willing to murder a child to make their point. It all bore the unmistakable stench of Barlow Pike's particular brand of corruption and intimidation. Pike was a name that cast a long shadow across the territory, and not all of that shadow fell in honorable or legally defensible places. He had arrived from back east 2 years previous, with substantial capital and even grander ambitions, buying up mining claims with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that in the American West, wealth was the only law that truly mattered. His operations had quickly earned a reputation for cutting corners where safety was concerned, and treating employees, particularly Indian laborers, who had few advocates and fewer rights, as expendable resources in the grand pursuit of profit, above all other considerations. The memory of his brother's death struck Tasunke with renewed force as he contemplated Pike's methods. Mapia had taken employment at one of Pike's mines 3 years ago, desperate for the wages needed to support their widowed sister Winona and her children through another brutal Dakota winter. The boy had been strong-willing and eager to prove himself worthy of the white man's grudging respect. He had descended daily into those death-trap shafts with the faith that honest labor would be rewarded with honest wages, that the safety measures supposedly required by territorial law actually existed for reasons beyond mere appearances. That faith had been crushed along with his body when a support timber deliberately weakened Tasunke, now suspected, had collapsed without warning, burying Mapia beneath tons of rock and silver ore, while Pike's foremen watched from their safe positions near the shaft entrance. The mine owner had declared it an unfortunate accident, the kind of tragedy that occasionally befell men who chose to work in dangerous professions. He had paid a token sum to the family, barely enough to cover burial expenses, and had resumed mining operations within the week. It was during Tasunke's bitter confrontation with the cavalry troops sent to investigate Indian complaints about mine safety that he had received his crippling bullet wound. That investigation had concluded with predictable efficiency that no evidence of wrongdoing existed on the part of Pike Consolidated Mining or any of its associated enterprises. The matter was officially closed, filed away with other examples of how justice worked when money talked loudly enough to drown out the voices of the powerless. Since that day, Tasunke had avoided Lantern's End, entirely choosing instead to live alone in the hills where he hunted game and trapped furs for the few supplies he required to maintain his solitary existence. His only regular human contact was with his sister Winona, who had gathered a small band of displaced Lakota families in a hidden camp along the river, all of them trying to forge some kind of dignified existence in a world that seemed determined to erase their very presence from the face of the earth. But now, this child had been thrust into his path, and with her came the possibility of finally learning the truth about his brother's death. And perhaps, if the spirits were willing of doing something meaningful about the injustices that had been allowed to fester in the shadow of Pike's wealth and influence. Oh, we must keep moving, he said, rising to his feet with a grimace as his damaged leg protested the movement with familiar spikes of pain. Those who took you will not abandon their purpose so easily. They have invested too much in whatever plan required your death to simply walk away when their first attempt fails. 2 miles from the creek, following game trails that wound through increasingly broken and difficult terrain, they crested a low ridge crowned with an ancient cottonwood, whose massive trunk spoke of centuries spent weathering the storms that regularly swept across the open plains. The tree provided welcome shade from the merciless sun, and its elevated position offered a clear view of the surrounding country for miles in every direction. To the south, columns of smoke rose from Lantern's End, like accusing fingers pointed at the cloudless sky, speaking of cook fires and chimney smoke and the normal activities of a community going about its daily business. To the north lay the hidden camp, where Winona waited with her small band of survivors, maintaining their precarious hold on traditional ways of life in a world that grew more hostile with each passing season. Their respite beneath the cottonwood's spreading branches proved all too brief. As Tasunke helped Lena down from Paint's back, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from the afternoon's exertions, he caught sight of movement on their back trail, 2 riders coming hard across the flats, following their tracks with the persistence and skill of professional manhunters who knew their business and took pride in their work. The warrior's hand moved instinctively to the carbine, slung across his shoulder fingers, checking the action and mentally counting the ammunition he carried. 7 rounds remained in the magazine, enough for a brief engagement, if circumstances forced such a confrontation, but insufficient for any prolonged battle against determined opponents. With a child to protect and his own mobility compromised by the old leg injury, flight offered better prospects for survival than standing and fighting against superior numbers and firepower. But as he studied the approaching horsemen through eyes trained by years of survival in hostile territory, he realized that the option of simple flight might already be foreclosed by circumstances beyond his control. The 2 men rode fresh horses and traveled light, unburdened by supplies or unnecessary equipment that might slow their pursuit. Meanwhile, he was afoot with a damaged leg that would limit his speed and endurance, responsible for protecting a frightened child who depended entirely on his ability to keep them both alive until they could reach some form of sanctuary or assistance. They would not be able to outrun professional pursuers across open ground where every movement could be observed from miles away. "Lena," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had grown accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. "Can you swim The child nodded, her eyes growing wide as she spotted the distant riders and began to understand the implications of their presence. Yes, but not very well. Pa taught me in the creek behind our house, but I've never been in deep water. That may be sufficient. When I give the word, I want you to take paint and ride as hard and fast as you can toward that line of willows marking the river course. Follow the water downstream until you find a camp of my people. You will know it by the smoke from cooking fires and the sound of children playing. Tell them that Tasunke sent you and that you carry news of Barlow Pike's men hunting in our territory. What about you? She asked, though something in her tone suggested she already understood what he was planning and did not approve of the sacrifice it would require. I will delay our pursuers, give you time to reach safety among people who will protect you from further harm. No. The word emerged with surprising firmness, for someone so young carrying the kind of absolute conviction that brooked no argument or discussion. You saved my life back there on those railroad tracks. I won't let you throw your own life away just to buy me a few extra minutes of safety. Tasunke looked at her with something approaching amazement. In his experience, white children were taught from their earliest years to fear and distrust Indians as dangerous savages who posed constant threats to civilization and decency. But this girl showed no trace of such prejudice, only the natural courage of someone who had already faced death and found herself equal to the challenge it presented. Before he could formulate any response to her unexpected declaration of loyalty, Lena began searching through her dress pockets with urgent fingers that spoke of someone who had just remembered something important. After a moment that seemed to stretch like hours, she withdrew a folded piece of paper that appeared to have been secured with a straight pin. This was attached to my sash when those men tied me to the railroad tracks, she said, holding the paper out to him with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and lingering fear. I managed to grab it when you cut me loose, though I'm not sure why I thought it was important at the time. Tasunke took the paper from her small fingers and unfolded it with the careful attention he might give to handling an unexploded artillery shell. The writing was executed in a crude hand, with a pencil that had been pressed hard enough into the paper to leave visible indentations as if the author had been laboring under strong emotion while composing the message. Bring Whitcomb's ledger to Devil's Backbone Bridge by dusk, or the girl dies for real next time. B. The warrior read the threatening note twice his mind, working through its implications with the methodical precision of a tracker reading sign in difficult terrain. A ledger that must be the mysterious book that Lena had mentioned, the one her adoptive father had brought home in such obvious distress the night before his disappearance. And B could only refer to Barlow Pike, whose given name was common knowledge throughout the territory, despite his attempts to maintain a respectable facade over his more questionable business practices. But it was the specific phrasing, "dies for real next time," that caught Tasunke's attention like a thorn-snagging cloth, suggesting layers of meaning and planning that went far deeper than simple extortion or intimidation. The wording clearly implied that Lena's placement on the railroad tracks had been intended as a theatrical threat. Rather than an actual execution, Pike had expected someone to discover and free her before the train arrived, probably one of his own men positioned for precisely that purpose. The entire scenario had been carefully orchestrated to create maximum psychological impact, while maintaining Pike's ability to claim innocence if questions were asked by territorial authorities. Tasunke's unexpected intervention had disrupted this carefully planned piece of theater, transforming what should have been a controlled demonstration of power into a genuine rescue that threatened to expose the elaborate deception for what it truly was. Your adoptive father possesses something that Pike desperately wants, he said, folding the paper with deliberate care and tucking it inside his shirt next to the place where his heart beat with increasing urgency. Something valuable enough to justify threatening the life of an innocent child to obtain it. The ledger book. Lena agreed, her young mind already working through the logical connections with impressive clarity. But I don't know where Pa hid it after he brought it home. He was already gone when I woke up this morning, and those men searched our house from top to bottom before they took me. The sound of hoofbeats was growing steadily louder, carried on the prairie wind with increasing clarity and urgency. The open ground around the cottonwood offered little in the way of concealment or defensive advantage, leaving them exposed to observation from virtually any direction. Tasunke made his decision with the swift certainty of a man who had learned through bitter experience to trust his instincts above all other considerations, particularly when those instincts had been honed by years of survival in territory where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Rather than attempt to flee across the flats where they could be run down like wounded deer by mounted pursuers with superior speed and endurance, he would use the terrain's natural features to their advantage. A shallow buffalo wallow lay perhaps 30 yards from the base of the tree, one of countless depressions scattered across the plains where the great herds had once rolled to rid themselves of biting insects and the accumulated dust of their migrations. Recent rains had filled this particular wallow with standing water and encouraged thick growth of marsh grass that would provide excellent concealment from searching eyes. "This way," he said, taking Paint's reins in his weathered hands and leading the faithful Mustang toward the natural depression with movements that betrayed none of the urgency he felt. "Stay low and make no sound that might carry on the wind." They slipped down into the wallow just as the first of their pursuers crested the distant hill, his mount lathered with sweat from hard riding across difficult terrain. Mud squelched beneath their feet, and the stagnant water carried the organic smell of decay and vegetation. But the tall grass provided excellent concealment from anyone who might be scanning the horizon for signs of movement or disturbance. With swift efficiency born of desperation, Tasunke removed his worn hat and slapped it sharply against Paint's muscled flank, sending the faithful animal galloping away across the grasslands toward the rocky hills that marked the eastern boundary of traditional Lakota hunting grounds. To any casual observer, it would appear that the fugitives had abandoned their hiding place and were now fleeing on horseback toward terrain that would favor those familiar with its hidden dangers and secret paths. The deception worked with textbook perfection. Within minutes, both horsemen thundered past the depression at full gallop, their attention focused entirely on the fleeing Mustang that represented their quarry's most obvious means of escape. Tasunke recognized them both from his years of observing Pike's operations from a distance. Red Deke, a mine foreman whose reputation for violence was matched only by his loyalty to whoever paid his wages, and Milan, a drifter who had arrived in the territory with questionable credentials and a willingness to perform any task that didn't require conscience or moral scruples. Tasunke waited until both riders had disappeared beyond the next rise before motioning for Lena to follow him as he began working his way through the concealing reeds toward the far side of the natural depression. His injured leg ached fiercely from the cold mud and awkward positioning, sending familiar spikes of pain up into his hip and lower back, but they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the scene of their deception before their pursuers discovered they had been following a riderless horse. They had nearly reached the edge of the wallow when the sharp crack of gunshots echoed across the grasslands, carried on the wind with startling clarity. 3 quick reports followed by angry shouts and the distressed whinnying of a horse in pain suggested that Paint had led the riders into the kind of rough, broken ground where his natural agility and sure footing would give him significant advantages over their larger cavalry mounts. "Your horse?" Lena whispered, her eyes wide with concern for the animal that had carried her to safety and was now risking its own life to ensure their continued freedom. "Will he be all right?" "Paint is cleverer than a fox and twice as stubborn as a mule." Tasunke replied with more confidence than he actually felt, though he could not entirely suppress a stab of worry for his longtime companion, who had shared so many dangers over the years. "He will lose them among the rocks, find his way back to us when it is safe to do so. That horse has more sense than most men when it comes to staying alive in hostile territory." They climbed out of the muddy depression and made their way across a stretch of increasingly broken ground toward the distant line of trees that marked the river's meandering course through this section of the plains. Behind them, more shots rang out with irregular rhythm, but the sounds seemed to be moving steadily away, rather than approaching, suggesting that Red Deke and Milan were indeed following the wrong trail deeper into terrain that would test their tracking skills and their mounts' endurance. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon when they finally reached the hidden camp where Tasunke's sister Winona maintained her people's precarious hold on traditional ways of life. The camp was tucked into a grove of ancient cottonwoods along the riverbank, concealed from casual observation by the natural contours of the land and the careful placement of brush shelters that had been constructed to blend seamlessly with their surroundings. Winona emerged from one of the dwellings as they approached, her weathered face creasing with concern at the sight of her brother's unexpected arrival in the company of a white child who bore obvious signs of recent trauma. She was a woman of perhaps 40 summers, her long hair streaked with premature gray from the hardships and losses she had endured since the coming of the whites had disrupted traditional patterns of life. Like Tasunke, she bore the visible marks of existence lived on the margins of an increasingly hostile world, calloused hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices, sun-darkened skin that had weathered countless seasons without adequate shelter, and eyes that had learned to miss nothing of potential importance to her people's survival. "Little brother," she said in their native language, then switched to English as she noticed Lena's presence and the child's obvious need for reassurance. "You bring troubled times to our doorstep." The troubled times were already here, sister, waiting to spring their trap on the innocent and unwary. Tasunke replied, his voice carrying the weight of recent revelations and growing understanding of the forces arrayed against them. This child was bound to the iron road like a sacrifice left for the great iron horse to devour. Pike's men placed her there with their own hands, intending her death to serve their master's purposes. Winona's expression darkened with comprehension as she absorbed the implications of her brother's words. She knew as well as anyone in the territory what Barlow Pike was capable of when his interests were threatened or his authority challenged. The mine owner's reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his apparent immunity from the legal consequences that would have befallen a less wealthy or influential man. Without further discussion, she gestured for them to enter her shelter, a simple but comfortable structure of bent poles covered with canvas and cured buffalo hide that had been arranged to provide privacy while maintaining connection to the natural world that surrounded them. The interior was neat and functional, with sleeping furs arranged around a central fire pit and various household implements hanging from the framework in careful organization. Once inside, Winona set about treating Lena's rope burns with the skill and knowledge of a woman who had served as healer for her small community since childhood. She moved with practiced efficiency, first cleaning the wounds with water that had been boiled with willow bark to prevent infection, then applying a carefully prepared poultice of herbs that would reduce swelling and promote proper healing while deadening the worst of the pain. "You have a beautiful name," she said as she worked, her voice carrying the gentle warmth that she reserved for children and those who needed comfort more than harsh truths. "Lena, it means light in the old tongue, the language my grandmother spoke before the coming of the white schools that forbade such knowledge. You will need all the light you can carry in the days that lie ahead of us." The child studied Winona's face with the frank curiosity that characterized the very young, showing none of the fear, disgust, or superiority that most whites displayed when confronted with Indian customs and ways of life. Instead, her expression reflected genuine interest in the healing techniques being employed and gratitude for the kindness being shown by strangers who had no obligation to help her. "Thank you for helping me," she said with simple directness that spoke of good upbringing and natural courtesy. "I know you're taking a risk by letting me stay here, and I don't want to bring trouble to your people." "All life is risk, child," Winona replied with a slight smile that transformed her weathered features and provided a glimpse of the beauty she had possessed before hardship and loss had left their marks. The only question worth asking is whether we choose to risk ourselves for worthy causes or unworthy ones. Protecting innocence from those who would destroy it for their own gain strikes me as about as worthy a cause as any I can imagine. While his sister tended to Lena's physical wounds with competent hands and gentle words, Tasunke stepped outside the shelter and scanned the horizon in all directions, his trained senses alert for any signs of approaching danger. The columns of smoke continued to rise from Lantern's End's direction. But something about their character had changed. During the afternoon hours, they seemed thicker now, darker in color, suggesting that more than simple cook fires and chimney smoke was feeding those distant flames. He was still contemplating this ominous development when Paint appeared at the edge of the cottonwood grove, moving with a pronounced limp that favored his left rear leg, but otherwise appearing sound and alert. The Mustang's sides heaved with exhaustion from his afternoon's adventure, and fresh scratches on his legs provided evidence of his passage through rocky terrain that would have challenged even the most skilled rider. But his eyes remained bright with intelligence, and his spirit appeared unbroken by the ordeal he had endured. Tasunke went to his faithful companion and examined the injured leg with careful hands, finding nothing more serious than strained muscles and minor cuts that would heal quickly with proper rest and care. Paint had more than earned his grain, and whatever comfort could be provided in this temporary sanctuary. "The riders who pursued you?" Winona asked, emerging from her shelter with Lena close behind both of them, showing concern for the animal who had played such a crucial role in their escape. "Lost among the rocks and probably cursing their luck by now," Tasunke replied with grim satisfaction. "But Pike will send others when these first two fail to return with their prize. The man does not accept defeat easily, and he has too much invested in whatever scheme required this child's death to simply abandon his plans when faced with unexpected obstacles." His sister nodded with the kind of weary understanding that came from years of watching her people's enemies adapt their tactics, while maintaining their fundamental goal of elimination through whatever means proved most effective. "Then we must abandon this place before those others arrive. There are too many tracks here now, too many signs of our presence for safety to be maintained much longer. Where will you take your people?" "North toward the Canadian line, where the winter spirits gather their strength. There are still places in that direction where blue-coat soldiers fear to ride their horses, and territorial law carries no weight among those who remember older ways of justice." The prospect of fleeing northward into exile held little appeal for Tasunke, who had already spent too many years running from one threat or another, always searching for sanctuary that seemed to recede like a mirage whenever he approached it. More importantly, he felt a growing sense of responsibility toward the child who had been thrust so unexpectedly into his care, and through her, perhaps a long-awaited opportunity to finally balance the scales with the man whose greed and cruelty had cost his younger brother's life. The message speaks of Devil's Backbone Bridge and a meeting at dusk, he said, producing the threatening note from inside his shirt and showing it to his sister. Pike expects someone to deliver Edwin Whitcomb's ledger in exchange for what he undoubtedly considers a generous offer of safe passage. The telegraph man's book. What secrets could such a thing contain that would be worth threatening a child's life to obtain? Evidence, most likely. Proof of crimes and corruption that Pike cannot afford to have exposed to the harsh light of honest scrutiny. Tasunke's expression grew thoughtful as he contemplated the possibilities. Records of bribes paid to territorial officials' safety violations that led to unnecessary deaths, perhaps even documentation of the deliberate murder disguised as mining accidents. Winona studied her brother's face in the growing twilight, reading the determination there with the skill that came from knowing him since childhood, and understanding the way his mind worked when faced with injustice that demanded confrontation rather than flight. "You mean to go to this bridge and face whatever trap Pike has prepared for you there?" "I mean to find that ledger first, wherever Edwin Whitcomb has hidden it from those who would use its destruction to bury the truth along with their victims. If it contains the kind of evidence I suspect, then it must not be allowed to fall into Pike's hands, or disappear entirely from the world of men who might still remember what justice means. And the child, what becomes of her while you pursue this dangerous course? Tasunke looked back toward the shelter where Lena waited, probably listening to every word of their conversation, despite their efforts to speak quietly enough to avoid alarming her with the full scope of the dangers that lay ahead. The girl had already proven herself capable of remarkable courage and resilience, but she was still only 11 years old and had already endured more trauma in a single day than most adults faced in their entire lives. "She comes with me," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of absolute conviction that brooked no argument or discussion. "Pike's men will not stop hunting her as long as she draws breath and represents a threat to their master's carefully constructed plans. The only true safety for her lies in exposing the complete truth about Pike's operations and ensuring that those truths reach ears that cannot be bought with silver or silenced with threats." His sister sighed with the deep weariness of someone who had watched too many people she cared about walk deliberately into danger for the sake of principles that the world seemed determined to abandon. She recognized the stubborn set of her brother's jaw and the particular light in his eyes that had appeared on other occasions when he had committed himself to courses of action that offered little prospect of survival, but provided the only hope of achieving something meaningful in an increasingly meaningless world. "You know this may very well be an elaborate trap designed specifically to lure you into Pike's reach," she warned with the careful tone of someone who knew her words would probably be ignored, but felt obligated to speak them nonetheless. "Yes, I understand the risks involved. But sometimes a trap is the only way available to catch the one who has set it, especially when that person believes himself safely beyond the reach of any justice, save that which can be bought and paid for, like any other commodity." As the sun touched the western horizon and began painting the grasslands in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of beauty, persisting despite human efforts to corrupt everything they touched, Tasunke prepared for what might prove to be his final journey to Lantern's End, and a long-overdue confrontation with the forces that had shaped his life through loss and hardship. He checked his weapons with the methodical care of a man who understood that his survival might depend on the proper function of every component filled his water bag. From the clear stream that ran past the camp and spoke quietly with Lena about the dangers that lay ahead and what would be expected of her courage and intelligence in the hours to come. The child listened with the gravity and attention of someone far older than her 11 years, asking practical questions about distances, tactics, and contingency plans that demonstrated a mature understanding of their situation despite her youth and inexperience. She seemed to grasp instinctively that their survival might depend on her ability to remain calm under pressure and follow instructions without hesitation or question, even when those instructions might conflict with her natural impulses toward self-preservation. "Are you frightened by what we must do?" she asked, as they prepared to leave the temporary safety of the hidden camp and venture once more into territory controlled by their enemies. Tasunke considered her question with the complete honesty that she deserved after everything they had already shared and endured together. "Yes, I am frightened," he said finally. "Fear is the body's way of preparing for danger, and it keeps you alive as long as you don't allow it to master your judgment or paralyze your ability to take necessary action when the moment arrives." "Good," Lena replied, with a determined nod as she adjusted the small pack that Winona had prepared for her containing food, water, and basic medical supplies. "Because I'm scared too, and I was worried that I might be the only one feeling that way. It helps to know that even warriors get frightened sometimes." The observation drew a genuine smile from Tasunke and the first real expression of warmth and humor he had shown since finding her bound to those railroad tracks what seemed like a lifetime ago. Perhaps there was indeed reason for hope, despite the odds arrayed against them and the powerful enemies who waited in the darkness ahead. They left the hidden camp as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. riding double on Paint's strong back toward a confrontation that would determine not only their own immediate fate, but also the future direction of everyone caught in Barlow Pike's expanding web of corruption, greed, and violence. Behind them, Winona began the familiar and heartbreaking process of breaking camp and preparing her people for yet another journey into exile. Another search for sanctuary in a world that seemed to offer fewer such places with each passing season. The night was still young, but it already carried the unmistakable scent of approaching violence on the prairie wind that never ceased its restless movement across the vast expanses of Dakota territory. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, powerful men were making final preparations for what they undoubtedly expected to be a simple matter of eliminating inconvenient witnesses and reclaiming stolen property that threatened their continued prosperity. They had not yet learned that sometimes the hunted could become the hunters, or that justice postponed was not necessarily justice denied forever.